You work for the NHS, not as a consultant or a senior manager with a salary that makes headlines, as a nurse, a ward nurse, the kind of person who works 12-hour shifts, skips breaks because there are not enough staff to cover them, drives home at midnight too tired to cook, and does it again the next day because the patients need someone and the ward is short, and you made a commitment when you qualified that you have not broken yet despite everything. Your pay rise last year was below inflation. Again. Which means in real terms your wages went down. Again. You have been told there is no money, that the NHS budget is under extraordinary pressure, that the choices are between this and that and the other and none of the options are good ones and the money simply is not there. And then you read a story, not a rumour, not an opposition press release, a freedom of information document, an actual contract, government procurement, your money, the money taken from your payslip every month before you ever see it, spent on something that nobody told you about. That was not debated in Parliament. That was not announced in a budget statement. That was not presented to the public as a spending decision requiring scrutiny and justification. £500 million, a single contract, with a single provider, for migrant accommodation services, signed, delivered, paid for, from the public purse that was too empty to give you a real terms pay rise. The man who found this contract and put it in the public domain is Rupert Lowe. He found it through one of the more than 1,000 Freedom of Information requests his team has filed since he entered Parliament. The same Freedom of Information process that the government subsequently tried to block him from using. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what the contract says, what it reveals about how the government has been spending public money on migration, why this specific contract was not meant to be seen by the public, and what Lowe's exposure of it tells you about the relationship between the British state and the people it is supposed to serve. Let us start with the contract itself, because the details matter, and they have not been reported clearly enough in the coverage that followed Lowe's exposure of it. The contract is worth approximately £500 million. It is a government procurement agreement for the provision of accommodation and associated services for people who have entered Britain irregularly, people who have crossed the Channel in small boats, people who have overstayed visas, people who are in the asylum process and awaiting a decision on their status. The scale of that single contract, £500 million, for accommodation services for one category of people in one part of the immigration system, sits within a broader pattern of migration-related public expenditure that has grown dramatically over the past several years. The total annual cost of housing asylum seekers in Britain has risen from a few £100 million a decade ago to several £billion annually. The use of hotels, commercial accommodation contracted at significant cost to house people while their asylum claims are processed, has been one of the most visible and most controversial elements of that spending. But the £500 million contract that Lowe exposed is not just a large number. It is a revealing number, because it demonstrates the scale at which the government has been procuring migration-related services through mechanisms that avoid the parliamentary scrutiny that spending of this magnitude would normally receive. Government procurement above certain thresholds is supposed to be subject to open competition. Contracts of this size are supposed to be advertised. Multiple providers are supposed to be invited to bid. The process is supposed to generate competitive pricing and accountability for public money. The contract Lowe found raises questions about how that process was applied, about whether the procurement was conducted in a way that ensured value for taxpayer money, about whether the terms and conditions, the obligations on the provider, the performance standards, the penalty clauses for failure to deliver are adequate given the scale of the public expenditure involved. These are not rhetorical questions. They are the basic due diligence questions that any responsible steward of public money should be able to answer clearly and publicly about a contract of this size. The government's response to Lowe's exposure was not to answer those questions. It was to express concern about the exposure, to question the manner in which the information had been obtained, to move quickly toward the restriction of Lowe's freedom of information access that followed shortly after. The response to accountability was the attempt to prevent accountability. That tells you something important. Now let us put this specific contract in the broader context of migration-related public expenditure. Because the £500 million is not an isolated figure, it exists within a pattern of spending that the government has consistently presented in ways that obscure its total scale. The Home Office budget for asylum support, the direct costs of housing, feeding and providing basic necessities to asylum seekers, has increased dramatically. The numbers are published in the Home Office annual accounts, but they are spread across multiple budget lines and presented in ways that make the headline total difficult to assemble without deliberate effort. The use of hotels as asylum accommodation has been one of the most debated aspects of this spending. At peak usage, the government was housing tens of thousands of people in commercial hotels at costs that ran to billions of pounds annually. The average cost per person per night in hotel accommodation is significantly higher than the cost in purpose-built asylum accommodation. The hotels were used because the purpose-built capacity did not exist, and building it had been deferred through decisions made by multiple governments over many years. The cost of the Rwanda scheme, the policy of processing asylum claims offshore, absorbed significant public money in preparation, legal challenge, and eventual abandonment before the change of government. The legal costs alone ran to hundreds of millions of pounds. The operational costs were not incurred because the scheme never became operational. But the preparation costs were real and they were paid by taxpayers. The cost of processing asylum claims through the Home Office's own administrative machinery, the caseworkers, the legal framework, the appeal processes, the tribunals, the judicial reviews, runs to billions of pounds annually when the full administrative cost is counted. The cost of the small boats response specifically, the border force vessels, the processing centres at Manston and elsewhere, the accommodation for people arriving by that route, adds further to the total. When you add all of these components together, the total annual cost of Britain's response to irregular migration and the asylum system runs to well in excess of £10 billion. Some independent analyses put it higher. The £500 million contract that Lowe found and exposed is one component of that total. But it is a component that was not meant to be visible. It was not announced. It was not debated. It was not presented to Parliament as a spending decision requiring approval. It was found by a man with a Freedom of Information request and the determination to use it. Now let us talk about why the government did not want this contract seen. The honest answer is straightforward. The £500 million contract, set alongside the public statements the government has made about the costs and management of migration, is not consistent. Ministers have made statements about their commitment to reducing the cost of the asylum system, about driving down hotel accommodation costs, about finding more efficient ways to manage people through the process, about being responsible stewards of public money in a period of fiscal constraint. A £500 million contract for accommodation services procured in circumstances that raise questions about competitive tendering and value for money is not easily reconciled with those statements. It is not that the spending is necessarily wrong in its entirety. The obligation to accommodate people in the asylum system exists. It is a legal obligation under both domestic and international law. The people in that system need to be housed somewhere. The cost of housing them is real regardless of what political position you hold on the broader migration question. But the obligation to house people does not require that the contracts for doing so be invisible, does not require that procurement of this scale escape parliamentary debate, does not require that the terms of the arrangement remain opaque to the public whose money is paying for it. The government's interest in keeping the contract invisible was not about protecting operational security. It was not about protecting commercial sensitivity in a way that genuine procurement confidentiality requirements would justify. It was about avoiding the political conversation that the existence of the contract would generate. A conversation about the total cost of the asylum system, about the relationship between public statements on migration management and the spending reality that lies beneath them, about the accountability gap between what ministers say about managing public money responsibly and what the procurement documents reveal about how that money is actually being spent. Lowe forced that conversation. The government's response was to try to prevent him from forcing it again. Let us now talk about the Freedom of Information process and what the government's attempt to restrict Lowe's access to it reveals. The Freedom of Information Act gives any member of the public, including elected members of Parliament, the right to request information held by public bodies. The What Do They Know platform provides a mechanism for submitting and tracking FOI requests in a publicly visible way, meaning that when an FOI request produces information, that information is visible to everyone who looks at the platform rather than just the person who requested it. Lowe's team has submitted over 1,000 FOI requests. That is an extraordinary number. It represents a systematic program of investigation, not random queries, but a structured effort to piece together a picture of government activity in specific areas where the published information is incomplete or misleading. The areas Lowe has focused on are revealing: grooming gang investigations, immigration and asylum costs, deportation failures, the gap between official statements and operational reality in key areas of government activity. The common thread is the attempt to establish what is actually happening behind the official narrative, to find the numbers that are not in the press releases and the documents that are not in the ministerial statements. The government's restriction of his "what do they know" access, justified on the basis that some requests were used for general messages rather than strict FOI purposes, came shortly after the £500 million contract exposure. The timing is notable. The restriction does not prevent Lowe from submitting FOI requests through other channels. Parliamentary questions, direct requests to government departments, requests submitted through his parliamentary office, all of these remain available. The restriction is an inconvenience rather than a genuine block on his investigative work. But it is a signal from the institutions he is investigating that they are aware of what he is doing, that they do not welcome it, and that they are willing to use whatever mechanisms are available to make it harder. The response of Lowe's supporters has been to crowdsource the FOI process, offering to submit requests on his behalf, distributing the research agenda so that multiple individuals can pursue the same lines of investigation independently. The attempt to restrict one person's access has produced a distributed network of investigators pursuing the same questions. This is not an accident. It is the logical consequence of trying to suppress accountability rather than provide it. Now let us talk about what this specific contract and the broader pattern it represents tells us about the governance of migration in Britain. The essential argument that Lowe has been making through his FOI work, through his parliamentary interventions, through the policy platform of Restore Britain, is that there is a systematic gap in Britain between the public narrative about migration and the operational reality. The public narrative says that migration is being managed, that costs are being controlled, that decisions are being made responsibly and in the public interest, that the system, while under pressure, is being handled by people who understand the trade-offs and are making the best available choices. The FOI documents say something different. They say that the costs are larger than the public narrative acknowledges, that the procurement of services has not always been conducted with the competitive rigour that spending of this scale requires, that the gap between stated policy outcomes and actual operational reality is significant and sustained. The £500 million contract is one data point in a pattern that Lowe's team has built through over 1,000 information requests into a picture that the government would prefer the public not to see clearly. The grooming gang inquiry that Lowe crowdfunded, the independent investigation that found the problem more widespread than official accounts acknowledged, is another data point in the same pattern. The deportation failure data that his FOI requests have surfaced, the cost of foreign national offenders being accommodated in British prisons, the breakdown between the publicly stated ambition on migration management and the number that actually gets removed annually. Each of these data points was found through persistent, systematic information gathering of exactly the kind that democratic accountability is supposed to enable. Each of them was not in the official narrative. Each of them was obtained against the institutional resistance of organisations that would prefer their operational reality remained invisible to the people funding them. Let us now talk about what Lowe is proposing to do about it. The most immediate proposal is the one that connects directly to the contract exposure. A complete independent audit of all migration-related public expenditure, not just the Home Office asylum support budget, but the full picture, including local authority costs, NHS costs, education costs, the legal and court costs, the law enforcement costs, the criminal justice costs of foreign national offenders. The honest total, published, audited, available to Parliament and to the public, as a basis for a genuine national conversation about what the asylum system costs and whether the current approach represents the best use of that money. The second proposal is procurement reform. Government contracts above a specific threshold for migration-related services should be subject to automatic parliamentary notification. Not approval. The executive's ability to procure services would not be constrained, but notification. Parliament would be informed of contracts of this scale, giving the opportunity for scrutiny and questions that the current system does not provide. The third proposal is a reform of the asylum processing system itself. Faster decisions, faster removal of those whose claims fail, faster provision of status to those whose claims succeed. The cost driver in the asylum system is time. The longer claims take to resolve, the more accommodation, support, and associated services are required. A system that resolved claims in weeks rather than years would cost a fraction of the current system regardless of the ultimate outcome of those claims. These proposals have varying degrees of political support across the spectrum. The audit is the most broadly supportable. It is hard to argue publicly against knowing what public money is being spent on. The procurement reform has support from MPs across parties who are uncomfortable with the opacity of government contracting at scale. The processing reform has been endorsed in principle by successive governments and consistently not implemented in practice. Lowe is not the first person to make these arguments. He is the person who found the £500 million contract that made them impossible to dismiss as theoretical. Here is the bottom line. A Freedom of Information request found a contract worth approximately £500 million. A single procurement for migrant accommodation services, not announced, not debated, not presented to Parliament as a spending decision of the scale it represents. The nurse who did not get a real terms pay rise because there is no money did not know about this contract. The family that had their housing benefit reviewed did not know about it. The person waiting 18 months for an NHS appointment did not know about it. Rupert Lowe found it. He published it. The government's response was to try to restrict his ability to find the next one. That response, the restriction rather than the explanation, the suppression rather than the justification, is the most important thing about this story. Not the contract itself, not the £500 million, but the choice made by people who manage public money on behalf of the public to treat accountability for that money as a threat rather than an obligation. Britain is not short of money. It is short of honesty about where the money goes. Lowe is trying to change that. Hit the like button if this gave you something real. Subscribe if you want the investigations that the government is actively trying to prevent. See you in the next one.